Imagine you're driving home, you hear a sudden bump. Maybe you clipped another vehicle pulling out of a parking space. Maybe you hit a side mirror. Maybe you got into what seemed like a very minor accident. Your heart starts racing, you panic. And before you've really thought it through, you drive away. Now, fast forward 20 minutes, you're sitting in your driveway, replaying the whole thing in your head. And one question keeps getting louder. Did I just make this a lot worse? See, the scary part, for many drivers, the accident isn't what creates the biggest legal problem. It's what happens in the minutes afterward. Because what feels like a harmless decision in a moment of panic can sometimes lead to criminal charges that are far more serious than the accident itself would ever be. So in this video, I'm going to explain what Florida law actually requires after an accident, what happens if you've already left the scene, the mistake that turns a stressful situation into a much bigger legal problem. I'm Danny Izquierdo, a Florida criminal defense attorney, and one of the biggest misconceptions I see people is assuming that leaving the scene of a minor accident isn't a big deal. After all, nobody was hurt, the damage seems small. How serious could it really be? That answer often surprises people because in many situations, it's not the accident itself that creates the criminal exposure. It's the decision to leave, and understanding that distinction can completely change how you handle the situation. See, most people don't leave the scene because they're trying to commit a crime. They leave because they're scared, embarrassed, panicked, confused. They're thinking emotionally and not strategically. And that's understandable. But here's the problem. Florida law doesn't focus only on the accident itself. It also focuses on what happened afterward. The moment you became involved in a traffic accident, certain legal responsibilities kick in. And that's where many drivers unknowingly create a second problem, which raises obvious questions. What are you exactly required to do? If you're involved in a traffic accident in Florida, you're generally required to stop, remain at the scene, exchange information, and cooperate with law enforcement if officers respond. A lot of people assume these rules only apply to serious crashes. They don't. Think of it like this. The law doesn't wait to see whether the damage is significant before creating obligations. Those obligations begin the moment the accident occurs, even when the damage appears minor, even when nobody seems injured, even when you think the situation isn't a big deal. And that's why many drivers are surprised to learn that the accident itself may be relatively minor, while leaving the scene can create much bigger legal consequences. But what if you've already left? And this is where a lot of people find themselves. See, the accident's already happened. They already drove away. Now they're wondering what comes next. Maybe they panicked. Maybe they genuinely didn't think there was damage. Maybe they convinced themselves it wasn't a big deal. Or maybe they simply weren't thinking clearly in that moment. If the accident just happened and you're only moments away from the scene, the situation may be very different than it would be hours later. But once time starts passing, things become more complicated. And that's because of something most drivers underestimate. And that's the investigation may already be happening. One of the biggest misconceptions people have is, if I just keep quiet, maybe nothing will happen. That might have been a reasonable assumption 20 years ago. Today, not so much. Think about how many cameras surround us every day. Traffic cameras, dash cameras, business security cameras, Ring doorbells, parking lot surveillance, and witnesses often pull out their phones before anyone even thinks about calling the police. By the time you're sitting at home wondering whether anyone even noticed, there's a good chance evidence is already being collected. We've represented people who were genuinely shocked when detectives contacted them days later because they believed nobody had seen the accident. But here's where things often go from bad to worse, not because of the accident itself, not because of the investigation, but because of what people do next. And this is where many drivers accidentally make the strongest evidence against themselves. Once they realize law enforcement may be investigating, they immediately try to explain everything. And that instinct is understandable. Most people believe if I just tell my side of the story, they'll understand. Unfortunately, criminal investigations don't work that way. The moment an accident investigation starts turning into a potential leaving the scene investigation, your statements can become evidence. Your statements can be used against you. And that's a critical difference. What you intended, what you meant, what you were thinking. See, those explanations don't always get interpreted the way you expect or would have hoped. That's why one of the most important things you can do is understand your rights before making statements that could affect your case. Because many people spend weeks trying to fix a statement they made in the first 5 minutes. What should you do instead? If you're watching this because you've already left the scene of an accident, don't panic, but don't ignore the situation either. See, every case is different. The amount of damage matters. Whether someone was injured matters. How much time has passed matters. And the available evidence matters. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. That's why getting experienced legal guidance early can be incredibly important, because a strategy that helps one person may be completely wrong for someone else. And in many situations, the decisions made during the first few days can have a major impact on how the case ultimately unfolds. If you're involved in an accident in Florida, remember this: the accident itself is not always what creates the biggest legal risk. Often, it's what happens afterward. Florida law generally requires drivers to stop, remain at the scene, exchange information, and fulfill their legal obligations. Driving away, even after what seems like a minor accident, can create consequences that are far more serious than the collision itself. And if you've already left, don't assume the situation will simply disappear on its own. The next decision you make may be even more important than the one you've already made.